All right, family, Scrapbook Boxing Museum of the Forgotten Fisticuffs series. This is part 2 of the history of the welterweight division. And I wanted to pick up on the Charlie Holmes saga. Now, what happened, Kid Gavilan would defeat Johnny Bratton, 15 rounds. And as I stated, he would not be fully recognized universally as the welterweight champion because Charlie Holmes of France would move up to the middleweight division is what actually happened. So in 1952, Carl Bobo Olsen would now move into as a contender because Ray Robinson would lose the light heavyweight championship challenge to Joey Maxim in New York's Yankee Stadium. So he retired. When he retired, a middleweight tournament was created. Charlie Holmes had to take on Randy Turpin. And Carl Bobo Olsen had to take on Patty Young. When Carl Bobo Olsen defeated Patty Young, he was now the America's middleweight champion. When Randy Turpin defeated Charlie Holmes, Randy Turpin then became the European middleweight champion. So Charlie Holmes was on the cusp of becoming a welterweight champion in France, which meant that he was then recognized as the number one contender for the welterweight division. So since Kid Gavilan would take on Johnny Bratton, then Kid Gavilan wasn't fully recognized because technically they were saying that Charlie Holmes should have been the logical contender for Johnny Bratton's title. So they were trying to unify. So that's where the mix-up was. So I just wanted to clarify that. October 20th, 1954, Johnny Saxton gained a decision over Kid Gavilan in 15 rounds. Fight took place in Philadelphia. It was at the Shrine Park. And he would win universal recognition as welterweight champion of the world. Now, April 1st, 1955, Tony DeMarco had won a title by knocking out Johnny Saxton. Johnny Saxton was from Newark, New Jersey, by the way. 14 rounds in Boston, Massachusetts. But on June 10th, 1955, Carmen Basilio had won a title by knocking out Tony DeMarco in 12 rounds in Syracuse, New York. Tell you about these two fighters. Both these men fought twice, and within 2 seconds difference, the exact same result would happen. One in Syracuse and one in Boston. Both men fought exactly the same, reminding me of Arturo Gatti and Irish Mickey Ward. And it was a classic. I mean a classic. I enjoy watching those fights as often as I can because it shows the passion and skill set. Both men were digging to the body. Carmen Basilio was dazed and didn't look like he was going to come out of that. But he came out of it, and he would go on to knock out Tony DeMarco. So that's a classic fight to watch. So June 10th, 1955, Carmen Basilio would win a title by knocking out Tony DeMarco. March 14th, 1956, Johnny Saxton had re-won the title by outpointing Carmen Basilio in 15 rounds in Chicago, Illinois. Carmen Basilio, until he expired, until he passed away, would tell you that he was robbed. He would tell you that the mob had everything to do with that fight. Johnny Saxton and Ike Williams were both, I wouldn't say so much affiliated, but their management team was with the Mafia, Philadelphia crime family. And I spoke with Carmen Basilio about that. I spoke with him about the Ray Robinson circumstance. And he had a lot of interesting things to say. Carmen Basilio was a pleasure to talk to. I met him several times, knew him personally. And he didn't speak much to many people. But I was fortunate enough for him to open up to me. And we had several conversations. And that was a great time in my life speaking to ex-fighters. R.I.P. to Carmen Basilio. September 12, 1956, Carmen Basilio would knock out Johnny Saxton in 9 rounds in Syracuse, New York. And he would regain full claim of the welterweight championship belt. September 23rd, 1957, Carmen Basilio would relinquish his welterweight championship title because he wanted to fight in the middleweight division to get a shot at Ray Robinson's title. And he would be successful in doing so. June 6, 1958, Virgil Akins would win the vacant title, knocking out Vince Martinez in 4 rounds, St. Louis, Missouri. This is when the tournament would then begin. And Carmen Basilio would relinquish his title to face Ray Robinson. Virgil Akins would knock out Vince Martinez. Now, I knew Vince Martinez. He was from New Jersey and had great conversations with him. He was something else. But he was stopped in 4 rounds in St. Louis, Missouri. December 5th, 1958, Don Jordan would win the title by decisioning Virgil Akins in 15 rounds. Los Angeles, California. Now, Don Jordan would defeat Benny Kid Barrett. You see, you had a lot of men in that tournament. You had Benny Kid Barrett, Don Jordan, Virgil Akins. I mean, you had a lot of good fighters in that tournament. Rory Calhoun. Oh, Charlie Fusel, you name them. They were in that tournament trying to get an opportunity at that title. Vince Martinez. And many, many others. Spiderweb, all of them. So May 27th, 1960, Benny Kid Barrett had won a decision, a unanimous one, I might add, over Don Jordan in Las Vegas, Nevada. And he would take the welterweight championship belt from Don Jordan. But on April 1st, 1961, Amo Griffith had won the title by knocking out Benny Kid Barrett in 13 rounds. Miami Beach, Florida. And this is when that saga would begin. September 30th, 1961. Benny Kid Barrett had regained the title by outpointing Amo Griffith on a 15-round split decision in Madison Square Garden. Why was this significant? Well, this is when the taunting would begin because of Benny Kid Barrett's sexuality. Amo Griffith's sexuality were different. Benny Kid Barrett would call Amo Griffith a maricon. And he would throw flowers at him, so on and so forth. And this would infuriate Amo Griffith. They were on a scale, and Benny Kid Barrett started laughing at him because Amo Griffith had on a pair of cowboy boots. But unfortunately for Benny Kid Barrett, he would take on Gene Fullmer. As he was the welterweight champion, he would challenge Gene Fullmer's middleweight championship title 6 months before he would face Amo Griffith for the 3rd time. It was March 24th, 1962. The fight took place in New York, Madison Square Garden. 12 rounds. And Barrett died as a result of injuries. Now, I spoke personally to the referee of that particular fight. And this referee lived on Cherry Street. He lived on the same block as a friend of mine, Teddy. And I would visit Teddy at least twice a week. He was a Jewish historian, and he used to fight back in the amateur days. And he told me about this fight with Benny Kid Paret and Emil Griffith. He also refereed Ray Robinson and Randy Turpin at the Polo Grounds. And this gentleman had explained to me what actually happened. He told me that Benny Kid Paret should have never faced Emil Griffith. It was too soon after the beating he suffered from Gene Fullmer. But what really did Benny Kid Paret in, and this is alleged, but this is what I was told personally on the couch of Teddy on Cherry Street, the housing developments there. He told me that Benny Kid Paret suffered injuries because at that time you didn't have padding on the poles, and Kid Paret hit the back of his head on the on the pole, because there was no padding during those days. And that's what really did the damage. Now, it didn't help that he was hit with a 28-punch combination by Emil Griffith. And clearly that contributed to it, as did Gene Fullmer fight 6 months prior. But this is what I was told by Ruby Goldstein, who was the referee for that fight. And we had about 4 hours of conversation about the entire history of boxing. He had to eventually leave. But when I went to Teddy's house, Ruby Goldstein was there sitting on the couch. And at that time, I recognized his face, but I didn't quite know who he was. Or know who he was at the time. And Teddy said to me, "Do you know who this man is?" And it took me a second. And I recognized his face, but I couldn't put it together. I was about 14 years old, maybe 13 at that time. And I learned about the history of Ruby Goldstein, his fight with Sid Terrace at the New York Polo Grounds. He was stopped in one round. In the Jewish community, everything shut down. The stores shut down. Kids couldn't eat. They had to call a doctor because they were depressed. You see, it was that serious at that time. This is the 1920s. So Ruby Goldstein understood the importance of being a hometown hero. So when he refereed Ray Robinson and Ruby Goldstein, Dr. Vincent Nardiato was going to order Ruby Goldstein to stop the fight because Ray Robinson had suffered a cut, laceration over his right eye. And Harry Wiley Sr. had asked Ruby Goldstein, "Ruby, do me a favor. Soldier Jones will handle this. Give him one more round. Can't stop the bleeding. Do what you have to do." And Ruby Goldstein said, "Harry, I'll take care of it." Because both these men were from New York. So Ruby Goldstein had explained to me about that situation that took place March 24th, 1962, the unfortunate incident of Benny Kid Paret. March 21st, 1963, Luis Rodriguez won a title by outpointing Emil Griffith over 15 rounds in Los Angeles, California. June 8th, 1963, Emil Griffith had regained the title by a second time outpointing Luis Rodriguez, 15 rounds, at New York's Madison Square Garden. June 12, 1964, Emil Griffith had retained the World Welterweight Championship title when he would defeat Luis Rodriguez, Las Vegas, Nevada, 15 rounds on a unanimous decision. March 30th, 1965, Emil Griffith had retained the World Welterweight Championship title. Decision in 15 rounds over Jose Stable at the New York's Madison Square Garden. September 22nd, 1965, Emil Griffith retained his welterweight championship title. In 15 rounds over Brian Servets, Wembley Stadium, London, England. December 10th, 1965, Emil Griffith had defeated Manuel Gonzalez. The New York Madison Square Garden in 15 rounds. He would retain his welterweight championship title. May 18th, 1966, Emil Griffith, by the edit of the New York State Athletic Commission, gave up his welterweight championship belt after gaining the World Middleweight Championship title. He had taken on Dick Tiger. Let me talk about Emil Griffith for one moment. I knew Emil Griffith, my father and I. Well, my father had known of him, but he didn't know him personally up until this point. We saw him on a train. I needed a car, so we took the train, number 7 train, going to Flushing, Queens, Times Square. And we saw him on the train because he lived in Queens. And no one recognized Emil Griffith. And I told my dad his Emil Griffith. So we went over to him, and he was open to conversation. And we asked him, of course, we led up to this conversation, but we asked him about that night with Benny Kid Perret. And Emil shut down. He didn't really want to talk about that with the media. But he had no problems discussing it with us. We were very fortunate that he opened up to us about this personally. Because they were Ringside was trying to do a documentary. And they needed his approval. In fact, they wanted his interview and everything else. And he was reluctant to do it. So we talked to Emil Griffith about that fight. He told us. He said he never wanted to kill this man. He said it haunts him till his day. Met his son in the park and they talked, and he felt a lot better about that circumstance. But he said he called me a Monicone. And we went back and forth with that. But from that point, we were friends with Emil Griffith. Emil Griffith had trained Simon Brown. He had trained Bone Crusher Smith. He had trained Juan Laporte. And many others. So Emil Griffith was a stand-up guy. He was friends with trying to think of his name now. He was a doorman. His name is Calvin. Calvin was the doorman at Gleason's Gym. And that was his buddy. But Emil Griffith was misunderstood. He was a hell of a fighter. 3-time welterweight, 2-time middleweight champion of the world. And he was a 1-time junior middleweight champion. He had defeated Don Jordan for that title. I'm sorry, not Don Jordan. Don Fulmer for that title. Gene Fulmer had 2 brothers, Jay and Don Fulmer. And Don Fulmer had faced Emil Griffith for the junior middleweight championship belt. It was the first time, and Griffith had defeated Don Fulmer. November 28, 1966, Curtis Coates had won a unanimous decision over Gene Jocelyn, Dallas Municipal Auditorium. And this was because Emil Griffith had relinquished his title. Curtis Coates had gained the World Boxing Association title in the elimination bout, defeating Manuel Gonzalez of Texas and Luis Rodriguez of Miami. In the meantime, Jocelyn of France had defeated Brian Surfix of Wales for the European title. The other American contenders were Ernie Lopez. He used to wear, they called him Indian Lopez. Las Vegas, Nevada. Ted Whitfield, Amherst, Massachusetts. He defeated Jocelyn for that title. Did Curtis Coates. April 17th, 1969, Jose Napoles stepped in the ring weighing 143 pounds. Mexico stopped Surfix. And he defeated Curtis Coates, who weighed 145.5 pounds, from Dallas, Texas, 13 rounds. And he would win the World Welterweight Championship belt. The title took place in Los Angeles, California. December 3rd, 1970, Billy Backus stepped in the ring weighing 145.5 pounds. Syracuse, New York. He stopped Jose Napoles, who weighed 144.5 pounds. And He defeated him in 4 rounds. Syracuse, New York. He won the welterweight championship belt. The referee was Jack Michelin. And Jack Michelin felt that fight needed to be stopped. June 4th, 1971, Jose Napoles weighed 146 pounds, and he would regain the title by stopping Billy Backus, 145.5 pounds, Syracuse, New York, in 8 rounds. The fight took place in Los Angeles, California. Billy Backus got a lot of opportunity for that welterweight championship strap. Now, to take it back for a moment, when Benny Kippenrett had took on Gene Foreman, Gene Foreman was supposed to face Reuben Hurricane Carter or Georgie Benton. But Reuben Hurricane Carter defeated Georgie Benton. So Gene Foreman's next title defense was supposed to be against Reuben Hurricane Carter. But he elected to face Benny Kippenrett instead. And that was the result. What was happening at that time? Ray Robinson had lost his middleweight championship belt to Paul Pender in Boston. And he was to have a rematch with Paul Pender. So the the NBA didn't recognize it, and they stripped Ray Robinson. So the NBA was now up for grabs, and you would have Gene Foreman. And Gene Foreman would take on Carmen Basilio. He would knock out Carmen Basilio. He was the only fighter to knock out Carmen Basilio, not only once, but twice. And Ray Robinson would lose to Paul Pender a second time. And when he lost to him a second time, that upset the upper card because that has never happened to Ray Robinson. No one thought that would happen. Anytime Ray Robinson lost, he always regained the title. So a lot of money was lost. The mob was bent out of shape. A lot of people lost their lives. Managers, booking agents, and so on and so forth. It's not talked about, but that was a big deal. This was information that came from my grandfather directly, because my grandfather was in the numbers business. And it was a lot went on during that time. Anyway, Ray Robinson would now be out of the championship level of competition, if you will, especially when he lost to Rocky Castellani. Once he lost to Castellani, that was it for Ray Robinson. But Paul Pender would then lose to Terry Downs. Then he would regain it from Terry Downs. And Dick Tiger would come in the mix. Paul Pender tried to get his title back, and he filed a lawsuit, lost the lawsuit, so he retired. Then Dick Tiger would take on a young man from Philadelphia. He was originally from Brooklyn, New York. His name was Joey Giardello. Now that's all middleweight. Let me get back to welterweight. So Jose Napoles would have regained his title from Billy Backus. But then you would have great fighters, such as Sugar Ray Leonard. You would have Thomas the Hitman Hearns. You would have Cervantes. You would have Pepino Cuevas. Benitez. And then later on in years, you would have Pernell Whitaker and Oscar De La Hoya. You would have Donald Curry and Marlon Starling, Moochie, Magoo, the Magic Man, whichever you want to call him. You have Mike the Body Snatcher McCallum. You have Earl Spence now, and you have Terrence Crawford. You had Sugar Shane Mosley, Miguel Cotto, Manny Pacquiao. Salute to the welterweight division. Great fighters have come out of that division. Ray Robinson was reigned pound for pound many years. Shout out to Ray Robinson. Thanks for watching. Salute.